Well, welcome back, everybody, to Fresh Catholic Teaching Courses Series number 7, our Lenten series entitled The Days of Holy Week, where we are going to do just that. We are going to go through each of the days of the original Holy Week, day by day, unpack what happened on each of those days. So when we enter Holy Week 2025, as we go through each of those days, we'll know what happened in the original day of the original Holy Week. And we'll be able to enter into each day, like we said the previous 2 episodes, maybe more deeply, more profoundly than we ever have before. This is episode 3 of 9. Episode 1, you'll recall if you've been with us from the get-go, was basically an introductory episode where I laid in some context and some background and explained how this particular series is going to play out. Episode 2, we got into the first of the days of Holy Week, that being Palm Sunday, and we looked at 2 events, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then once in Jerusalem, Jesus inspecting, checking out the temple before he and his disciples left Jerusalem, went back to Bethany to spend Sunday evening at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So today, episode 3, we're looking at Monday of Holy Week, and we're going to be looking at 2 events on this day, the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus is going to be cursing and cleansing on Monday of Holy Week. By the way, something I should have mentioned in the introductory episode, but didn't, but we can file this under better late than never. You know, some of the days of Holy Week have official titles, official names. The other days over the time have kind of gotten unofficial titles or unofficial names. So whether it's an official name or an unofficial name, each day of Holy Week has its name. For instance, Sunday, the official name is Palm Sunday. Monday, the unofficial name is Cleansing Monday because Jesus cleanses the temple. Tuesday, the unofficial name is Teaching Tuesday, because that's the day Jesus teaches in the temple area, and he gets peppered with all kinds of questions from all the different factions of the Jewish religious leaders. So Tuesday unofficially has come to be known as Teaching Tuesday. Wednesday unofficially is called Spy Wednesday, because that's the day Judas, in stealth, as spies operate, that's the day Judas cut his deal to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So Judas cutting this deal in stealth, acting as spies do. Wednesday's always been called Spy Wednesday. Thursday, the official name, of course, is Holy Thursday. Friday, the official name, of course, is Good Friday. Saturday, the official name, Holy Saturday. Sunday, the official name is Easter Sunday. So the days of Holy Week, about half of them have official names. The other half have unofficial names. And this episode we'll be looking at Monday, whose unofficial name is Cleansing Monday, because the big item that happens on this Monday of the original Holy Week is Jesus cleanses the temple. So better late than never. Should have been in episode number 1, but there you go. So let's officially start Holy Week Monday of the original Holy Week. So Sunday night, Jesus and his disciples have spent the evening in Bethany at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. It is now Monday morning. He and his disciples leave Bethany and head back into Jerusalem. Now, this is the morning, Monday morning. On the way into Jerusalem, Jesus spots a fig tree from a distance at the side of the road. And this fig tree is in full leaf. So because it's in full leaf, the way fig trees are, when they're in full leaf, that indicates they have figs on them. So when Jesus sees this fig tree from a distance in full leaf, he's expecting figs to be on it. Now it's Monday morning, so he approaches the fig tree because he's hungry. And when he gets to the fig tree, even though it's in full leaf and it should have figs, it doesn't. And when he sees that it doesn't have figs, when he sees a case of, you might say, false advertisement, because again, if a fig tree is in full leaf, it's advertising it has figs that are ready to eat. Well, this fig tree was in full leaf, so that's what it's advertising. When Jesus gets up closer, it's a case of false advertisement because the fig tree has no figs. And because it has no figs, Jesus curses it. He tells the fig tree, "May no figs ever grow from you again." And the fig tree withers and dies. Now, let's hit the pause button for a second, okay? Jesus cursing a fig tree because it doesn't have figs? What's going on? That sounds so un-Jesus-like. You know, we might say, you know, with all due respect, Jesus, okay, it's Monday morning. Maybe you haven't had breakfast. You left the house of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. You're hungry. You see a fig tree in full leaf. You think you're going to grab a few figs and satisfy your hunger. It doesn't have any, and you're upset. But is that enough to curse the fig tree to the point that it withers and dies? This sounds so un-Jesus-like, and we got to ask ourselves the question, what's going on? Is he that hungry? Did he get up on the wrong side of bed? Is the pressure of Good Friday looming? Is that starting to get to him already, and he's starting to stress out? Because this doesn't sound very Jesus-like. And by the way, if we kind of fast forward a bit later on into this day, the other thing he does this day doesn't sound very Jesus-like either. Because when he does arrive in Jerusalem, and when he does go back into the temple, we know what he does. He makes a whip of cords, and he just drives out the merchants and the animals. He overturns the tables of the money changers, scattering the coins everywhere. He accuses them of making the temple a marketplace instead of a house of prayer. And if we take a look at these two events on Monday of Holy Week, and we look at Jesus and his reactions, we've got to kind of scratch our heads and say, boy, you know something? This doesn't sound very Jesus-like. This seems so out of character for him. Cursing fig trees, making whips of cords, driving out merchants, turning over the tables of money changers. What's going on, Jesus? Well, before we get into the particulars of these two events, let's kind of provide some context. Now, granted, both of these are separate events. Cursing a fig tree, cleansing the temple. They're separate events. But separate though they are theologically connected. Because like we saw yesterday in Holy Week and last episode, everything about the triumphal entry we learned had deep theological significance. Same thing here. The cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, they're separate events, but they're connected because they each have deep theological significance, and they're both what we call in theology acted out parables. Now, we know that Jesus' public ministry, he performed miracles, he did a lot of healing, and he did a lot of teaching. A lot of his teaching was in the form of parables, so we know Jesus taught in parables. But now we learn that that's not the only way Jesus conveyed parables. Yes, he did it by teaching, but he also conveyed parables by acting them out. And the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, they are both what we call acted out parables that have a prophetic meaning and message. So it's not a case of Jesus being super hungry or getting up on the wrong side of the bed or having a bad hair day or the stress of Good Friday getting to him already. That's not why he's going to curse the fig tree or cleanse the temple. He's going to do it because in doing it, he's acting out two parables that have very deep theological significance and that have a very definite prophetic meaning and message. So there's a lot more going on behind these two activities than what first meets the eye. So with that context in place, knowing these things are acted out parables, and by that Jesus is trying to do some teaching through them, now let's dig into the cursing a little more deeply, and let's dig into the cleansing a little more deeply. So again, let's go back to the cursing, right? It's Monday morning. They're going back into Jerusalem. He spots a fig tree in full leaf. A full leaf fig tree is advertising, I have figs. Jesus gets up close to it, no figs. He's angry, he curses the fig tree, it withers and dies. Now, what's the deal with that? Well, the fig tree was, in the Old Testament, Israel was often symbolized or characterized as a fig tree. So, when Jesus gets up to the fig tree and it has no figs and he curses it, he's basically sending a prophetic message to the nation of Israel. Because again, at this point in time, from a distance, now look at the parallel I'm going to try and set up. The fig tree, from a distance, it was in full leaf. It was advertising figs, all right? If you looked at Israel and its religious system at the time, at a distance, it looked like it had everything you wanted. It had a grand, glorious, ornate, awesome temple. It had a priesthood. It had 7 liturgical feasts. It had all kinds of temple services and temple worship. So from a distance, the religious system of Israel looked like it had everything you needed. Just like from a distance, the fig tree looked like it had figs. But when you got closer to the Jewish religious system, you see how the Jewish religious leaders had basically hijacked it and corrupted it and made it into, in many cases, a money-making venture. And they were making the practice of religion burdensome on the people. So you start to see the parallel. The fig tree, from a distance, it looked great. Up close, not so great. The Jewish religious system, from a distance, it looked great. Up close, not so great. So the fig tree was symbolic in its false advertising, like the Jewish religious system was falsely advertising. In both cases, the fig tree and the Jewish religious system, from a distance, they looked great. When you got up close, not great at all. Okay? So in cursing the fig tree, Jesus is in essence cursing, condemning, rendering judgment on the Jewish religious leaders and the Jewish religious system and how it had been hijacked and corrupted. And the fig tree withering and dying is indicative of this Jewish religious system will then wither and die as well. So you can see when Jesus curses the fig tree, it's not a case of he was hungry and he wanted breakfast and he couldn't get any, so he went ballistic, right? In cursing the fig tree, he is condemning and passing judgment on the Jewish religious leaders and what they've done with the Jewish religious system. The fig tree represented the Jewish religious system. From a distance, both looked great. Up close, there was nothing behind it. So in cursing the fig tree, he's basically passing judgment on the Jewish religious system. So that's the deeper theological significance, and that's the parable that he's acting out. He's passing judgment on the Jewish religious system, not through words, but by actions. And those actions are cursing what the nation of Israel often was symbolized as, a fig tree. So that's the cursing of the fig tree. So after Jesus curses the fig tree, they continue on into Jerusalem. They hit Jerusalem, they go back to the temple. But today, Jesus doesn't just inspect it and check it out and leave. Now Jesus does what we call, he cleanses it, all right? Now, let's provide some context, all right? What he does when he cleanses the temple is and we know the story, he drives out the merchants and their animals. He overturns the temple, the tables of the money changers, right? Now let's provide some context and some background. Who are these merchants and who are these money changers? Well, again, let's go back to something we established the first episode. In the Jewish liturgical calendar, there were 7 feasts. Again, 3 of those 7 are pilgrim feasts where you had to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate them. One of those 3 was the Passover, which we're talking about here, right? So you would have all kinds of people coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Well, they're coming from oftentimes great distances. So it would be very difficult because when they arrive in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, they're going to sacrifice an animal, right? It would be difficult if you're coming from a long distance, practically speaking, if you're coming from a long distance, it was difficult for you to bring your sacrificial animal that long distance with you. Because a lot of things could happen. The animal could get injured along the way. The animal could die along the way. You might meet thieves and robbers, and they might steal the animal. So it was very difficult to bring an animal a long distance into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And even if you were able to get your animal there intact, the money that you had, because again, we're under Roman occupation, right? The money that you had was Roman coinage. And Roman coinage had the image of Caesar on it. And you couldn't bring that into the temple because that would be considered blasphemous. So even if you could get your animal to Jerusalem intact, the other problem you would have is you would have to exchange your Roman coinage for temple coinage so you can use it in the temple. So to make things a little bit easier, they set up a system where if you're coming from a long distance, you didn't need to bring your animal with you. Just bring yourselves, right? When you get to Jerusalem, you're going to make 2 stops. The first stop is you're going to exchange your Roman coinage for temple coinage. Then your second stop is you're going to take that temple coinage, purchase your sacrificial animal, and then sacrifice it. So everything was done there. It was a lot more practical. It was a lot easier. And it was a good idea, okay? So what was Jesus's problem with it? Because it was very practical, okay? You just brought yourself. Stop 1, you exchanged your money. Stop 2, you bought the animal. You did both right there, and then you sacrificed the animal. It really streamlined and made the whole process a lot more practical and a lot easier. So what was Jesus's problem with it? Well, he had several problems with it. Originally, the merchants selling the animals and the money changers with their tables, they were outside the temple, kind of in the parking lot, so to speak, right? Even though they didn't have cars, right? So this was done outside the temple. And then you went into the temple. Well, over time, these were brought into the temple area. So now the merchants and the animals, they were doing business inside the temple area. The money changers and the bartering back and forth, that was done inside the temple area. So what was a process that was set up with all good intent outside the temple area, over time had been moved inside the temple area. Now, if we look at the temple area, it was segmented into various parts. So the first part of the temple area would be called the court of the Gentiles. So if you were a Gentile and you wanted to kind of worship the one true God, you could only go that far into the temple. The next area was the court of the women. So if you were a woman, you could only go that far into the temple. The next area was the court of Jewish men. So if you were a Jewish man, you could only go that far into the temple. The next area was the holy place. And if you were a priest, that's where you went. And then finally, there was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest entered only one day of the year on the Day of Atonement. So the temple itself was segmented into areas. Now, what happened is the merchants and their animals, the money changers and their tables were moved inside the temple in the court of the Gentiles. So if you were a Gentile, it would be very difficult for you to worship God. Even if you were a woman and were in the next area up, or a man the next area up, it would still be very difficult, because you would have merchants haggling, you would have animals snorting, you would have money changers haggling over coinage. It would smell. Picture it this way. Think of your particular parish, right? And think of if your pastor, all right, instead of having this in the church parking lot, now had moved it in to the first 10 rows. He'd taken out the first 10 rows, the first 10 pews, and he moved in money changers and merchants and animals where the 10 rows in the back of the church were. Can you imagine trying to pray and trying to celebrate Mass with all of that going on behind you? It would be impossible, okay? That's the first problem Jesus had with it. He didn't have a problem with the process itself. He had a problem with the process being brought into the temple area and disrupting the prayer service. That's why he accuses them of making his Father's house, turning it from a house of prayer to a marketplace, because that's in effect what they did, okay? Now, the other problem Jesus had with it is not only were they doing this business inside the temple itself, the merchants in selling the animals and the money changers in exchanging coinage, they were ripping off the people. The merchants were selling animals at such an exorbitant price that they could pocket a lot of profit. The money changers were exchanging money, and the fee they were charging to do it was exorbitant, and they were making a lot of profit. So not only was this money-making venture brought into the temple, which is bad enough, the people coming to the temple to celebrate the Passover were being ripped off. That's how badly the Jewish religious leaders had hijacked and corrupted the Jewish religious system. So that is why Jesus was so incensed when he saw what was happening, how it was happening, ripping off people, and where it was happening inside that first area of the temple. So what does he do? We know what he does. He makes a whip of cords. Now let's consider this for a couple of seconds. You don't make a whip of cords in an instant. To make a whip out of cords, you have to slowly bind one cord and a second cord and a third cord. It took a little time to make a full-on whip out of a bunch of individual cords. So you can almost imagine in your mind's eye, inside the temple area, in that outer court of the temple area, merchants selling animals, animals snorting, money changers haggling over money, Jesus looking at this whole thing and slowly putting together this whip of cords. And you can imagine him getting angrier and angrier and angrier at what the Jewish religious leaders have done to his father's house, the temple, and what they have done to the Jewish religious system. Made it a money-making venture where they're pocketing enormous amounts of money. So he makes this whip of cords. He drives out the merchants and their animals, all right? Then goes to the money changers, overturns their tables to such a degree that the coins are scattering everywhere. And that's where he makes his accusation. You have turned my father's house from a house of prayer into a marketplace, which is exactly what they did. Now, we said the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple are acted out parables. So in performing these actions, in cleansing the temple, what parable, what is he trying to teach through these actions? Well, the fig tree stood for the nation of Israel, like we indicated. And in cursing the fig tree, he is cursing, what the Jewish religious leaders and the Jewish religious system had become. In cleansing the temple, when he cleansed the temple, when he drove out those merchants and money changers, that activity in the temple stopped. And in doing that, the prophetic message he was sending is, you know something? Just as this money-making venture has been stopped dead in its tracks, there's going to come a time where this temple is going to be stopped dead in its track. There's going to be a time where this temple is destroyed. And in fact, that time did come. This is 33 A.D. In 37 years from now, 70 A.D., the Romans are going to move in, they're going to destroy Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy the temple. So in cleansing the temple and in cursing the fig tree, he's telling them, look, there's going to come a time when Jerusalem and this temple will be no more. Just like the fig tree was no more, and just like this money-making activity was no more because he put a stop to it. That's the prophetic message. That's the teaching. That's the condemnation and the judgment he's rendering on the Jewish religious leaders, the Jewish religious system, and the nation of Israel in general. All right? Now, a kind of a side note. The person whose idea it was to bring the merchants and the money changers from outside the temple inside the temple. Now, the current high priest at this point in time is a man named Caiaphas. And we're going to see him Thursday and Friday of Holy Week. But the current high priest is Caiaphas. The former high priest was his father-in-law, Annas. And even though Caiaphas is the current high priest, it was understood that Annas, kind of a high priest emeritus, he was really the power behind the throne. Yes, Caiaphas was the acting high priest, but Annas still held a lot of sway. And it was his idea to bring the merchants and the money changers into the temple, okay? It was his idea to take what was a very practical and well-intentioned process and to make it into a situation where they ripped off the people and lined their own pockets. It was Annas' idea. So when Jesus cleansed the temple and stopped that activity, he was taking money out of the pocket of Annas. Now, if a little bit of a kind of a teaser here, when Jesus is eventually arrested, okay, the first person he's brought to, and when we get to this day in Holy Week, we'll unpack it, the first person he's brought to is Annas. Why is he brought to Annas first? Because Annas wants first crack at Jesus because of what Jesus did when he cleansed that temple. And what he did is he stopped this profiteering and he took money out of Annas' pocket. So now Annas wants first crack at hanging a death sentence charge on Jesus. Interesting. So that's the cursing of the fig tree, and that is the cleansing of the temple, okay? Both of them have deep theological significance in that both of them are acted out parables with a prophetic message, and the prophetic message, the parable, the teaching Jesus is giving them through his actions is he is passing judgment, he is condemning the Jewish religious leaders, the Jewish religious system, and the nation of Israel in general, okay? That's the deeper theological significance behind Jesus cursing the fig tree and it withering and dying, and Jesus cleansing the temple and stopping that money-making activity. Because 37 years from now, in 70 A.D., that temple will be destroyed and Jerusalem will be destroyed. And by the way, one other detail will slip in. If we go back to the cursing of the fig tree, Mark gives us an interesting detail. He tells us Jesus curses the fig tree, right? He tells us the fig tree withered, right? But he drops in this detail, and it's easy to miss. He tells us the fig tree withered from the roots. So this was a complete and total withering. It wasn't just a few branches up top that withered. This fig tree withered from its roots. It was full, it was complete, it was a total withering. And when the Romans move in 70 A.D., their destruction of Jerusalem and their destruction of the temple will be total and complete. So total and so complete that Jesus will tell his disciples in what's called the Olivet Discourse that there's going to come a time when this temple not only will be destroyed, but not one stone will be left standing upon another. This temple and this city is going to be not only destroyed, but totally and completely destroyed. Just like the fig tree was totally and completely withered from the roots, and the temple and that money-making activity was totally and completely stopped, with the merchants being driven out and the tables of the money changers being overturned. So Jesus is sending a very, very definite prophetic message to the Jewish religious leaders, the Jewish religious system, and the nation of Israel in general. That is the real meaning behind what Jesus does on Monday of Holy Week in cursing the fig tree and cleansing the temple. So once Jesus cleansed the temple, once he drove out the merchants and overturned the tables of the money changers, he calls it a day, so to speak. He and his disciples leave Jerusalem. They go back to Bethany to spend Monday night at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So that is Monday of Holy Week. Its unofficial title is Cleansing Monday. It's also come up with another unofficial title where it's called Cursing and Cleansing Monday, because as we've just learned, that's exactly what Jesus does. He curses, he cleanses the fig tree and the temple, and it's not a case of him being the stress getting to him. He's acting out parables with prophetic meaning and messages. So that's on that note, we'll wrap up episode number 3. We'll wrap up Monday. Episode number 4, we'll move into Tuesday of Holy Week. And just to kind of give us a little preview, Tuesday, the unofficial title is called Teaching Tuesday, because what Jesus will do is he and his disciples will go back into Jerusalem. They'll go back into the temple area, and Jesus will spend the day teaching the crowds that have come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And as he's teaching, all the different factions of Jewish religious leaders ask him questions. Not because they want to know the answer. They're asking him questions hoping to trap him and discredit him in front of these crowds, as if to tell the crowds, look, this guy's a fraud, don't follow him, come back and follow us. So that's what's going to happen Tuesday of Holy Week, and that's why it's called Teaching Tuesday, because Jesus is peppered with these questions while he's teaching in the temple area. So with that, we're at about the 36-minute mark. As always, thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. Thank you for supporting this series. And until episode number 4, Teaching Tuesday, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care, God bless, and continue to have a holy and blessed Holy Week.